It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby. God blasted him on the spot. Ghost. Yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek.
It's been a few days, but not that long, since the previous edition of, what is this podcast again? Yes, it's the Bible Geek. And we've got a bunch of goodies in the rain barrel tonight, which I want to get right to. But first, I'd like to inform you of another podcast, which you may know about, but if you don't, you should. Gary Stevens' podcast, The History in the Bible. I'd like to just read you a bit of his own description of it, which is better than I can do, from his website, and I think you'll see it's probably your kind of thing. It says, in this podcast, I will present the latest research into the biblical texts and the archaeological evidence behind them. I will also explore the religion of ancient Israel. Until the 1970s, archaeologists of Israel and Palestine saw their job as demonstrating the historical validity of the Bible. A new band of archaeologists and scholars has overturned that notion. The Bible is no longer seen as a document whose words must be proven, but as a starting point in providing a new and reliable history of the Jews and the development of Judaism. Their conclusions are radical. That the Israelites are Canaanites who forged a new identity, that there was no Exodus, that King David was not much more than a bandit, that the empire of Solomon never existed, and that the God of Israel may have had a wife, Asherah. All this, the New Wave say, was whitewashed by the authors of the Old Testament, or Tanakh, who only put pen to paper centuries after the events they wrote about. Few people outside the rarefied world of academia have been aware of this intellectual ferment, this revolution, until now. In the History in the Bible podcast, I will take you inside this revelation in biblical studies in a series of fortnightly podcasts. And of course, you know, that means every 2 weeks, right? Each episode will be a bite-sized chunk, about 20 minutes long. There will be 2 series. In the first series, I will cover the history and archaeology of the Old Testament from the patriarchs and the origins of the Hebrews, then the Exodus, and the conquest of Canaan, through David and Solomon, to the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judah and their prophets. I will discuss the Babylonian exile, the return, and the subsequent history of the Jews from the Persian period through the Hasmonean kingdom to conclude with Judea as a Roman province. I will show how scholars think that the various threads of the books we now know as the Bible came together, and what the latest archaeological discoveries and controversies can tell us about this long history. I will also cover the vast literature that was produced after the Babylonian exile, sometimes called the pseudepigraphical works. None of these works made it into either the Old or New Testaments, but they influenced both of the daughter religions of the ancient Israelite faith, Rabbinical Judaism and Christianity. In the second series, I will discuss the development of the New Testament and how it evolved amongst the many strands of Christianity over 5 centuries. So, sounds pretty good to me, and you ought to check it out. The title of it again is The History in the Bible podcast. Not of, but in the Bible. So I hope you'll check that out. Okay, on to the questions on this here podcast. This is from Jonas Lidman. And I guess it just escaped the innards of the whale, right? It says, my great-great-great-grandfather, Sven Lidman, 1784 to 1845, was, before he started his clerical career, He would end up as the cathedral dean of Linköping, almost making it to the position of bishop in the same city if he hadn't lost the elections in 1823, was a bit of an explorer. He traveled to, among other places, Egypt, bought, among other things, old biblical manuscripts, including at least one copy of St. Jerome's Vulgate, and other ancient objects, almost all later lost in a great fire in Constantinople in 1818. Oh, I would have loved to see those objects. You and me both, Jonas. Anyway, I have some 600 letters of his that I'm currently reading, and how he, when in Berlin, visited the university where he attended some lectures, one by none other than the legendary Friedrich Schleiermacher. Or as my mentor, Robert Streetman, a fellow Mississippian, used to say, Schleiermacher. Sorry, Jonas. I recall you mentioning him and in a positive context. Perhaps I remember it wrong? Oh no, always positive with Schleiermacher. He also mentions another scholar by the name of Mar Heinecke, whom information about seems scarce, or perhaps I'm misspelling his name. The letters aren't always easy to read. Yeah, I can't figure who that would be. Anyway, my question is about the notion that some atheists have about purging society of religion in order to create a perfect world, as they seem to believe that organized, religion is the root of all evil. I don't think you're caricaturing him, Jonas. Now, I think this is sort of a foolish idea, mainly because who decides what religion is? Religion and philosophy, at least in my humble, non-educated opinion, do often overlap. So is philosophy out the door also? Better to be on the safe side, or just part of some philosophies. I see it now, the thought police monitoring the discussion. Yeah, we allow your little philosophy study group to discuss philosophy, so you need to move away from that topic to religious, which is forbidden, remember? Or politics, for that matter. I think there are a lot of semi-religious political movements, such as communism, which incorporates a sort of messianism, the strong leader who does everything perfectly. Eschatology, the purging of the world, in this version, the slaughter and bloodshed of everyone who doesn't fit into their model, in order to create a heaven on earth, etc. Or the way some atheists are more evangelical in the sense of spreading their gospel of atheism than even the most evangelical Christians. I just find this idea so ludicrous that it's beyond belief, no pun intended. What's your take on this? Perhaps I'm just making one big straw man of the atheist position? No, I don't think so. I understand you're commenting on the general shape of developments these days. I do not understand you to mean that you're indicting every atheist and every atheist group or activity. So I wouldn't say you're making a straw man. I see these trends too. And you might, there does seem to be this idea of using the separation of church and state to suppress any public mention of religion. I think many would deny that, but it seems to me that this is really a kind of a not-so-hidden agenda, that they want to scrub the public square of any kind of religious reference. Because there is this intolerance that even if religion is part of a culture, as long as there are people that don't believe in it, the public display of this religion, the public honoring of it, is an insult and a suppression of those who don't believe in it. I think that is kind of a highly exaggerated view, and it's just an excuse to try to muzzle religion. Now, I think I do not believe in any religion. I'm not arguing for it, but I do appreciate it as a cultural and artistic creation of the human spirit. It goes bad often, But that's not because it's religion, that's because it's the invention of those pesky human beings. And the things we don't like about it, bloodthirsty fanaticism and intolerance, certainly have been evident in atheistic, secularistic movements like Soviet communism. I don't know how anybody can deny that. Now, some atheist apologists will say, well, you see, those guys were wrong, but what was wrong was that they were acting religious. Now, wait just a second. That seems to me to be slicing the pie in one's own favor. It's kind of like Protestants that say Catholics aren't really Christians, etc. I mean, this bizarre categorization to explain away the bad parts of your own view, or of some atheist views, by saying they're too much like religion, whereas it seems to me that since you do have religion that does not have these traits, those tolerant religious people are not being less tolerant. They're not being less religious, but are simply, they have combined religion with a more laid-back and humane view, whereas our militant atheists seem to be militant for militancy's sake. It's nothing religious about that, and so I don't buy that, and I do think it is a tragic, though also funny, irony that those who resent having belonged to fundamentalism, and I've certainly felt that way, are now becoming like what they hate. They still have the same patterns of combativeness and feeling like they need to save the world, not by recruiting people to religion, but by recruiting them out of it. And I feel like I would rather not just switch teams. I'd rather get out of the stadium and find another game to play. And one last thing, it also seems to me that we are witnessing a wave of intolerance on the part of very left-wing people, who, just as there's been political intolerance on the right too, but currently we're seeing a suppression of free speech and free expression by a kind of propaganda use of shaming with political correctness and so on, and that, I think, does stem from the inherent I know better than you intolerance of the far left. I would recommend Jonah Goldberg's book Liberal Fascism on that point. And please understand, Democrats and liberals, I am not criticizing you necessarily, because it is clear that liberals and Democrats have not always been this way, and I think for the sake of their own movement, they need to no longer allow these people to carry the banner of liberalism. That way we can start having a real conversation again. Let's see. Okay. Thanks, Jonas. I guess I could have done a bad Scandinavian accent, but I guess I don't have the energy. Phil the Thrill says, you've educated me quite a bit on the tenuous existence of the historical Jesus, and you've answered questions in the past about how generally you believe that a mythical Jesus came to be regarded as a historical figure. Based on a recommendation from your site, I also purchased Did Jesus Live in 100 BC by G.R.S. Mead, and while I'm only halfway through, it's a very provocative tome. My question is this: whether a historical Jesus was a 100%... Oh, no, I'm sorry, I can't read tonight. I was 100 BCE mystic, or whether he never existed at all. If you don't take the Gospels as, well, gospel, why did the Jesus movement take place at this time in history? If he was a 100 BCE Mystic, why not then? If he never existed, why did his myth spring up when it did? Does it have something to do with the attitudes of post-temple destruction Judaism? You've mentioned that religious leaders often fabricate recent history to add authority to their pet issues, so that would mean that something was happening between 70 and 150 CE to cause these figures, whoever they were, to proclaim Christ lived merely a generation before. What's your take? Well, I think that the historicization of Jesus in that time, I think Arthur Drews, spelled like Drews, D-R-E-W-S, one of the great Christ myth theories, I think he answered that one by saying it was an attempt to, by Catholics and some Gnostics, to pull a trump card out and defeat their rivals whose revelations from Jesus were received in visions and so forth, period. Since there's no way to verify such things, right, as Irenaeus makes clear in truly humorous fashion, then you could say, well, look, and you see this in the Pseudo-Clementines, by the way. You, Simon Magus, you can have all the visions you want. Anybody can. But we actually saw this man and learned from him. So we got it from the horse's mouth. This is supposedly Peter speaking. It's not historical, but it does show this polemical principle, right? So you can say, and this is exactly what Ritschl said in the 19th century about Protestant pietists, is you guys are have a little talk with Jesus, etc., and he walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own, and so Jesus is speaking to you. Why do you need this imaginary playmate Jesus when the only Jesus you've got is the historical Jesus? And Ritschl was pretty confident you could isolate he was a classic Protestant liberal. He thought you could isolate the historical Jesus, who, what a surprise, was kind of a liberal, liberal Protestant. But his point was a good one. You see, you pietists are in danger of obscuring the only Jesus we know we have behind the cloud of your subjectivity and your creative imagination. I'd rather stick with the Jesus we know we have, the historical Jesus. Now, of course, he had no, I'm sure he knew of the Christ myth theory, but he wasn't taking that seriously. He did figure you could know about the historical Jesus. But it was that, Drews says, and I think he's right, that had led to the initial historicization of Jesus. You wanted to posit that there had been a verifiable historical founder who said thus and so, and not what you Gnostics are saying. And as I say, some Gnostics tried the same tactic. Oh, look, we are in touch with the original disciples. That's why you've got Gnostic texts attributed to Peter and Thomas and Matthias and so forth. So too could play at that game, but that's where the game came from. It had to do with the state of Christianity at the time, and it was an attempt to suppress and defeat one's rivals. Now, if there was, and the relevance to the Christ myth theory of what Mead points out, that there is a body of evidence showing that some people thought Jesus had lived about 100 BCE. And so what does that mean for the Christ myth theory? Well, he didn't, but in my opinion, that shows that the mythical Jesus, historicized, kept getting updated, as you mentioned, that he kept becoming, as history went on, you had people place him further and further up, nearer their own time as they went through time, right? Because it only works if you can say, we got our teaching from people he taught directly, just a couple of links down the chain. If you start saying, well, some centuries ago Jesus was around, you're going to have the same problem Martin Luther had with Catholic tradition. There's too much water under the bridge, right? So I think that's the relevance of it, and the fact that Irenaeus thought Jesus died at the ripe old age of 50 under the reign of Claudius Caesar, and so on. It implies to me that that there was no historical memory of this, that the various estimates were like those of Herodotus trying to pinpoint Hercules in the historical time stream. You figure there had to have been a historical Hercules. Now, when would he have lived? And he came up with a couple of possibilities and then gave up because he couldn't reconcile all the evidence, and I think we're in just that position with Jesus. So that's the relevance of Mead's work for the historical Jesus, the mythical Jesus, the Christ myth theory hypothesis. Good question, Phil. I hope that helps. Justin M. White says, I'm interested in reading the Quran, but I'd like an annotated version since I didn't grow up with a knowledge of Islam in the same way other people would have. There are a few online ones, such as the Skeptic's Annotated Quran, which makes nice connections to other parts of the text that a novice reader like me might miss, but I'd like something more textual, critical. Are there any editions of the Quran that could fill this role, or other books that delve into its construction? Yeah, there are some books from Prometheus Books and others, written or edited, depending, by the great ex-Muslim scholar and critic of Islam, Ibn Waraq. Of course, it's the prefix IBN and WARRIQ. And he has the search for the historical Muhammad and the origins of the Quran and various other ones, collecting important essays on just this, and with a lot of essays translated into English for the first time. His latest one is a massive volume called Christmas in the Quran, and that one is a little slow going, but it's vital information. I am encouraging the author, who I'm pleased to say is a friend of mine, to prepare an annotated Quran. He certainly could do it, and I think I've got him interested in doing it, because there's a lot you can say. And maybe the best annotated edition, again, this is not my field, so I could well be missing stuff, might be Bell's edition of the Quran, where he sort of deconstructs it on the theory that a lot of the incoherence of the Quran is due to the same mess that we find in the Gospel of John and 2 Corinthians, that people were just almost randomly piecing together fragments, and he has notes to that effect in there. I don't know that they're really, that it's going to be enough of what you're looking for, but it's a big 2-volume work, and it's can't think of the guy's first name, but it's Bell, like the ringing a bell. His version of the Quran. I'm sure you could find it on Amazon or something. Okay, this is a question from Abdel Daoud, first prophet of the Aten, A-T-E-N. Let's see. I took a break from listening to the podcast while listening to a few audiobooks. I've caught up again, and I'd like to thank you for answering the question I sent late last year. I hadn't realized how incoherent it had become with all of my re-editing until you read it. Still, you managed to identify all the parts of my question. However, the follow-up I asked ended up making too little sense, so I'd like to retry it. My main question was whether Mark was possibly the work of a single author creating What would Jesus do? Stories for the uninitiated to be able to relate to the heavenly Jesus figure. You said it was more likely to be a product of a Marcionite community, but you didn't dismiss the possibility that it could be almost entirely fabricated by that community, hence stories recreated from the Old Testament, etc. Yeah, just to pause there, what I'm suggesting was that those who believed in a Jesus who was on earth, even a docetic one, such as the Marcionites did, having rejected the Old Testament, no doubt knew the Old Testament pretty well and were reluctant to get rid of all the good stuff in it, and so salvaged a good bit of it by rewriting it as Jesus episodes. So that's probably what he's talking about. As a follow-up, I asked, what would this do to the concept of a Jesus hero cult? What I meant by that is, if the Gospel of Mark is the fictional product of a small group of authors, doesn't that process obviate the need for a historical hero cult? In creating fiction, the writer or writers of Mark would base the stories on Old Testament stories, but the fictional models that they had were those of mythic heroes. They would write their own super Jesus stories in that style. Works based on Mark, even very loosely, would likely include the mythic hero stuff without there being any hero cult to produce the writings. Perhaps there are other indications of a hero cult, or perhaps it's needed to cover the view that Mark collected independent stories. But I would be interested to know what evidence other than Mark exists for the cult. Certainly the other cultic origins, Dying and Rising God, Mystery Religion, Philo, gods. Do we need anything other than Philo to account for most of the New Testament? Certainly the other cultic origins are very compelling, but the hero cult is one that I'm not sure I've really heard you deal with. May the black sun forever curse you with wisdom. Okay, thanks. Well, I'm kind of drawing on the work done by Helmut Kester, James M. Robinson, and Burton L. Mack in their terrific books, Kester and Robinson, Trajectories Through Early Christianity, and Mack's A Myth of Innocence, where both of them are kind of using a Zitzim-Laban argument, asking who would have written and read this kind of gospel material. And in fact, there's a lot of work done by others too. Clyde Weber Votow, back I think in the late 19th century, talked about Jesus in contemporary hero biographies, especially that of Apollonius of Tyana. And there's a lot of debate over not just whether you find the hero archetype in the gospel, but is it promoted or opposed. A major book on Mark from that standpoint was Theodore J. Whedon, W-E-E-D-E-N, Mark Traditions in Conflict. Came out, I think, in 1971 or something. And he argued that Mark embodies a kind of running battle between an aretalogy, biography of aretes, power or virtue, thus a kind of sacred biography or hero biography, that understanding of Jesus as what they used to call a theos aner, a divine man. There were Jewish versions of this. Look at the way Josephus and Philo both depict Moses as a kind of a superman inspired by God. And there was Apollonius of Tyana, who was like a god because he was so full of divine wisdom. And there was a Hercules religion. People would, in their initiatory rite, would don a lion's mane to join sacramentally in the hero's victory over the Nemean lion, and so on. Hercules had been poisoned and went to his death on a pyre, and from it rose to Olympus to become one of the gods. So death and ascension and so on. So there were hero cults, and even rubbing off on Judaism. There were also novels about heroes and heroines who narrowly escape death and have all sorts of adventures. And it seems to me that when you see the story of Jesus fitting the mythic hero archetype, somebody is viewing Jesus as a hero. And Whedon was trying to say that the evangelist Mark was trying to combat this with a sort of a proto-Lutheran theology of the cross, that it's because Peter at least represents those who saw Jesus as a superhero. He says, when Jesus says, I have to be crucified, he says, God forbid. Well, Matthew puts the words in his mouth, but Mark says he rebuked Jesus for this. And Jesus then rebukes him in turn. Get out of my sight, Satan! And so forth. And I tend not to view it that way, actually, but Whedon's book is certainly great. And so he's saying, there was this hero cult element among the various Jesus movements. And I think, however, that he's reading a bit too much into the cross, as everybody has always done, and that the cross is not central in the Gospels, at least not in the Synoptic Gospels. I wrote an article on this called The Marginality of the Cross. And what's happened is that the cross is just the darkness before the dawn. It's the final hurdle the hero has to jump. So the point is, it's really a triumphalistic theology, if you want to call it that, of the resurrection. The difference between this and a Jesus mystery religion is it wouldn't necessarily involve your tapping into this sacramentally, though it could. I mean, I just mentioned how the Hercules religion had a participatory aspect, but you wouldn't have to have it. You could simply worship Jesus as a divine hero and a vindicated immortal. And I mean, there were even shrines to sports heroes in the ancient world. So, I mean, we practically have literal hero worship even today. And so I think that there were such groups in the neighborhood, and that the shape and apparent purpose of a great deal of gospel material would make the most sense if it came from a hero worship faction with Jesus. So, thank you, Abdel Daoud. This one is from the mighty Sir John, without whom we wouldn't have much of a show. I tell you, without the two witnesses of Revelation, Sir John and John, there wouldn't be any Bible Geek. Talk about heroes. Anyway, Sir Jan says, it's been a while since my last geek fashion, so let me get to it. 1, in the May 28th episode, you talked about King Ahab and the relationship to King David. You rightly said that the latter would not be considered the ancestor of the former, but I do think there is a connection going back to the Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman. According to them, in the time before the Assyrian conquest of the Kingdom of Israel, it was much more populous and prosperous than the undeveloped Kingdom of Judah. The Omrid or Omride, I've never known how to pronounce that. Omride. That's the one founded by King Omri, another version of the name Omar. The Omrid dynasty expanded the territory, conducted trade, and built cities and public buildings. That came to a screeching halt when the Assyrians destroyed it and Judah started to develop, in no small part with help from refugees from the north. But the Deuteronomistic history was written in the south, in Judah, which explains why northern kings like Ahab get the bum deal in the stories. I think it also explains the stories of the magnificent Davidic and Solomonic Empire, where the author of the Deuteronomic history wanted to one-up the despised Omrids. So, their historical territorial expansion and riches of the kingdom are dwarfed by David and Solomon's imaginary ones. Building projects like the Megiddo stables are backdated a century or two. What thinketh the geek? Wouldn't be surprised. That could well be. I was just reading Michael Golder's book, The Psalms of the Sons of Korah, where he suggests that these two groups, well, he's got another book, The Psalms of Asaph. He says these two groups were Levitic, at least priesthoods of the northern shrines, and these psalms were used in their worship in Dan and later in Bethel. And once the Assyrians took over, these priests found shelter in Judah, and the Jerusalem temple adopted some of their psalmody. So this would be sort of another case of the same thing. Makes a lot of sense, Sir Jan. Thanks. He says, I also have a question concerning pronunciation of ancient words. Uh-oh. Often you say that you probably butcher this or that ancient word or name, but how does anybody know how it is supposed to be pronounced? Cross-references between languages help to an extent, I guess, but you would have to be confident these references hold over the centuries of what is essentially a long-term game of Chinese telephones. Without recorded audio, the spoken word is very ephemeral after all. For example, you often hear that Romans pronounced C as hard K rather than the soft S. But how do we know that for sure? Good question. Like, how do we know, for instance, about the great vowel shift? Right? How do we know about what the vowel points were supposed to make the words of the Torah sound like? I don't know. I'm not a linguist, and linguists do seem pretty sure about this. I don't know. Like Bible names, I'm guessing they're going from modern Hebrew or traditional Jewish pronunciation, though often our English Bible names are pretty far away from anything that could have been the original, like Isaac. At least today, you'd pronounce the original Yitzhak. I love both of them. Or James, Jacob, or Yakub, and stuff like that. I don't know. I welcome those who do to share with you and me. It's a real good question. Okay. Roman Montero. I have a question about the trial accounts in the Synoptics. In Mark 14:62, after being asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus replies, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." It's the same reply in Matthew 26:62, but Luke leaves it out. I have no idea why he would. It sounds like such a good response. You see, he has something very different, right? He says, look, whatever I said, you wouldn't believe me, and if I asked you something, you wouldn't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. So there's some version of it in there. And one difference is that in Luke and Matthew, Jesus' reply appears to be equivocal. If you say so, or you say, what does that mean? You said it, or that's what you said. I've heard it argued both ways. I tend to think it's equivocal. Okay, here's my question. If Jesus is quoting Daniel 7:13 through 14, as well as Psalm 110:1, that's where the one like the Son of Man takes his seat next to the throne of the Ancient of Days, and then sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Why does he replace the divine name with dunamos, power, rather than kurios, Lord? Given that everywhere else in the New Testament that I know of, the divine name is rendered as kurios, instead of Yahweh, which had been replaced in spoken readings with Adonai, which apparently does mean Lord. Also, what's going on with the high priest using the term blessed one for God? Are you the son of the blessed? Is there another place in the Bible where God is called the blessed one? Where does he get that from? I am not sure if there is an Old Testament passage with the blessed. My uncle, a Bible geek himself, thinks that the usage of the right hand of power rather than just Lord might indicate that Jesus actually vocalized the divine name right to the face of the high priest, which would have been a slap in the face to the high priest, who was the only one who was supposed to use the name when giving the atonement offering. Could there be anything to that? Well, I'm not quite with him there, but I do think it has to do with avoidance of saying the name of God, or even using the sort of second best name, Elohim, generic for God, though nowadays it's beginning to look like even Yahweh was generic, and that there were various deities called that. But I think the point is that they're trying to show this, we might say, excessive reverence for the divine name. You know, in the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name. Like, we want to give it proper regard. We don't want to risk taking it in vain because we're not quite sure what misusing the name would constitute, so we're going to just avoid it, except for the high priest on the Day of Atonement, because that can't be vain or a misuse. And so you have the priest saying, the Son of the Blessed, meaning God, but you're trying to be so reverential, you use what's called sometimes a pious circumlocution. You're talking around it, like you know who we mean. And that Jesus' answer does the same thing. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Elohim does kind of mean the strong one, but yeah, dunamis, the power, same thing. They're both sort of backing away from using either Yahweh, which nobody would. You can see what would happen to anybody that did by watching the life of Brian, right? But all I said was, this halibut is good enough for Jehovah. And you wouldn't even want to say God if you could avoid it, which is why, like, Hasidic Jews speak of Hashem, the name, instead of saying that name. Or the way some Jews will write on paper or on a blackboard, G-D, because they don't want the name of God to be up there and be erased or written on a paper that's going to be burned. And no. If it's there, you got to treat it with great respect. And I think that's what's happening. I do not think Ethelbert Stauffer was correct in saying that Jesus, by saying I am in Mark, at least most manuscripts of Mark, was trying to do a Charlton Heston impression and say, I am that I am, much less a Popeye impression. I am what I am. But I think it does have to do with reverential paraphrase of the name of God. So I'm glad your dad is a fellow Bible geek. Give him my regards. This is interesting. Got some listener background. I always love this. This is from Brent, and he says, to give a bit of background information about myself, I'm a long-lapsed oneness Pentecostal who has been an atheist for something like a decade. This was preceded by a few years of questioning and holding various private heterodox beliefs, such as that perhaps Paul didn't truly preach the original Christianity. That perhaps might have been an adverse reaction to having to memorize the entire book of Romans in Bible quizzing. After a long time of, though that sure comes in handy when you want to be a Bible scholar, after a long time of avoiding religious questions entirely, I've recently been trying to reacquaint myself with religion and, in particular, the historical circumstances in which Christianity evolved. I've mostly been doing this by listening to YouTube videos while at work, as my reading time is taken up with dissertation research. Your podcast has been a very interesting and informative addition to my admittedly dilettantish interest in this. Bravo. If there's anything I want to encourage, it's being a dilettante. In fact, we could probably rename the show The Bible Dilettante. Anyway, he says, Brent says, my status as an apostate oneness Pentecostal is what leads me to my first question. As I'm sure you know, members of the UPC, the United Pentecostal Church, and other oneness Pentecostals reject the Trinity and adhere to a type of modalism. As a result, my entire career as a Christian was premised on rejecting something that is a fundamental premise of the Christianity of nearly every other Christian. Pausing, I think most Bible Geek listeners know what modalism is, but just in case, it means that there are not three persons sharing the divine nature, but that there is one divine person who reveals himself or who acts in three different modes or roles, Father, Son, and Spirit in turn. Okay, where was I? This probably made it easier to reject all Christianity once I rejected oneness Pentecostalism. When questions around the Trinity were raised, most of my fellow church members would patiently and proudly point out that the word Trinity is nowhere to be found in the Bible, and assert that the Trinitarian formula for baptism was a later interpolation, perhaps not realizing the effect of this knowledge on my yet developing view of biblical inerrancy. While this had the intended effect of making the Trinity seem ridiculous to me, it was never really enough. Most of the, quote, theology, unquote, that I encountered was unchallenging and clearly written to simply assure average laypersons that we were right, and nearly every other Christian throughout history was damned for having been baptized as a baby, and perhaps even worse, not in Jesus' name. You know what Brent means here, right? That I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That's only in Matthew, and Eusebius gives us some grounds for thinking that that is an interpolation, and so that according to this theory, what had been the baptismal formula, well, doesn't exactly put it this way, but in Acts you do have several times it repeated that they were so and so was baptized in the name of the Lord Jesus. And so oneness Pentecostals figure out that's the way to go, and that's what they do. What Brent says, when I questioned this, I was pointed to a book, the author's name escapes me, but it's of little consequence, that asserted that there has nearly always been a group of oneness folks and or Pentecostal people who spoke in tongues, even if the history is sketchy at times. I seem to recall Peter Abelard being one of these presumed anti-Trinitarians. Boy, I doubt that. Of course, this seems like a desperate Hail Mary pass to avoid the inevitable question of how God could have permitted a world in which no one would be saved from the early Christian era until Azusa Street. You know, major Pentecostal revival right at the beginning. My question, how much, if any, basis do they have for asserting a trail of salvific breadcrumbs from Pentecost until the modern day? It seems to me, based on my scanty knowledge of religious history, that modalism as a theology was pretty much gone until the modern day. There seems to be even less evidence that the indwelling of the Holy Ghost as evidenced by the speaking of tongues was a seriously held position. The first time I ran across this sort of connect the dots salvation history of speaking in tongues and Pentecostal phenomena was in John Sherrill's fascinating little book. Oh my gosh, wait a minute. What the heck was it called? Oh, brother. Tongues of Men and Angels? I don't think so. Oh man, I can't believe I've forgotten. But John Sherrill, he was an editor at Guideposts. Oh boy, what was that book? Anyway, but I've read it other places too, and they'll say the Montanists spoke in tongues, which they did, and various so-called heretical groups in medieval Catholicism and so forth. They're not too eager to throw in the Mormons, but they revived glossolalia. And it's any way you cut it, they're admitting it was sort of an underground stream that emerged only sporadically. Of course, everybody does this, right? The Mormons claim that they have apostolic Christianity, which vanished from sight for hundreds of years until Joseph Smith. The Plymouth Brethren say that the church lost sight of the true church order for hundreds and hundreds of years until John Nelson Darby reconstructed it. Victor Paul Weyerwell, who started The Way International, he made the same claim. Of course, Harnack and Ritchell and the liberal Protestants did the same thing, that early on Christians switched over from the religion of Jesus to the religion about Jesus, and now they have recovered it. It's a common stratagem, and of course they really believe it, but what's really happening, I think, is that they're coming up with their own reading of it, which seems to them clearly true. And they figure, well, how come I had to discover this? Well, I guess I rediscovered it by the leading of God. And if it's true, well, it must have been known way back when, but forgotten until I came up with it. And you can never really... they don't pretend that they can show that this was always the Christian view, right? No, it's not like George Orwell's Ministry of Truth. They're trying to say, yes, it was suppressed, and you only see it occasionally. Now, the bigger problem with it, as you point out, is if you're going to say that, and there's nothing inherently implausible about that, of course, right? The religions do evolve and change over history. That's not... that's not a crazy view. But the problem is, if you're going to say the people that didn't have benefit of this original truth all those centuries, too bad they're in hell. Right? Mormons don't say that, for example, and I'm pretty sure the Brethren don't say it. Mormons, in some program I saw, this guy went out of his way to say, look, we are not saying that Martin Luther and all these people of the past not knowing about Jesus in America and the Book of Mormon, which they couldn't have known about, are damned. No, they were true Christians. It's just that now that we have benefit of this, you'd be doing the right thing to get on the bandwagon, but they try to make it very clear they weren't making this outrageous claim that it's like the old conundrum, what does God do about the heathen in Antarctica who've never heard the gospel, and they're going to go to hell? Of course they wouldn't mind because at least it's not so cold. And they say, well, gee, I can't imagine God would do anything that unfair. So like Billy Graham says, I don't know what it's going to do, but I do know it's a fair and just God, and I'll leave it to him. Well, you're like putting all of these Christians for a couple of thousand years in the same position. If your revelation that you just came up with is real Christianity, you're making all of the Christians of the past, well, like the Old Testament saints, or like the heathen in Slobovia. They didn't know it because they couldn't have known it. Is God going to destroy them all? And it seems like an awful lot of chutzpah goes into that. But again, speaking in tongues, as you say, was known. I think modalism must have come up. With modalism, I got a slightly different thing to say. As I always do with the Trinity, the Church does not claim that the Trinity is an understandable concept. They say there is a deep mystery here, and the Trinity is just trying to head off dangerous oversimplifications like modalism, because you're reducing the true God, whatever he may be, to some whittled down cognitive idol that you can get your head around. You really think you could comprehend the infinite God? Not likely. So don't think something as simple as modalism would do it. I respect that, but the problem is you got to have something in mind. You can't just say, well, worshiping whatever the heck fills the blank. And I think people, in effect, are forced to become practical modalists or tritheists. So, in a sense, modalism, I think, has always been around, just not formally. Okay, back to Brent. Secondly, I have a question that has been bothering me. I hope this isn't something that you've addressed, but I believe I heard discussion in 2 different places regarding these verses and not together. 1 Corinthians 2, 7 through 8. King James Version, because that's one thing atheism can never beat out of me. But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory, which none of the princes of this world knew, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. It's my understanding that princes of this world is referring to demons and spirits rather than prefects and Sanhedrins. However, Mark 5, 6 through 7 says, but when he saw Jesus afar off, as the Gerasene demoniac, he ran and worshipped him and cried with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not." How can these two be squared? I don't recall ever hearing any discussion of this seemingly blatant contradiction, and a Google search hasn't helped. It seems hard to reconcile even within the Gospels, let alone in contrast to what Paul says, the Apostle Paul Lind, of course. Did only the little demons running around possessing poor Gadarenes know that Jesus was Lord, but Satan, who is presumably instigating the whole mess, did not? This can't be, because we know that Satan knows who Jesus is since he tempted him in Mark 1:13. Does Mark not see any role for Satan in crucifying Jesus? Now there is a contradiction, but I don't think it's quite where you're spotting one. The 1 Corinthians passage seems to imply that the archons, the powers that rule this age from the lower heavens, that they did know that Jesus was the Lord of Doxa, the Lord of glory, and wanted him out of the way. They didn't understand what they were doing, that they were signing their own death warrant. Now, in the Ascension of Isaiah and various other texts, we have it's stated that Jesus put on the semblance of whatever kind of body was appropriate to the different concentric spheres through which he descended to get to earth, so that the archons wouldn't recognize him. And there you got a problem with 1 Corinthians, right? But and so there's no real problem with the rulers of this age, the archons, knowing who Jesus was. They just were in the dark about the plan of salvation. And there's no contradiction really between that and Mark's having the demons know who he is, right? We're not told that they know what's to happen to him. And you get the impression in Mark and Matthew that Satan, who, as you say, of course, does know who Jesus is, does not want Jesus to be crucified, implying that he does know that this mustn't happen or I'm out of business. Because when Peter says to him, "God forbid, Lord, the crucifixion, must never happen to you. Get behind me, Satan." Right? And implicit in the desert temptation narratives is the idea that Satan doesn't want Jesus to pursue his mission. But in Luke and John, you have the idea that for Satan it's full speed ahead, because he's the one that puts Judas up to betraying Jesus so he'll be crucified. It's very different. And so you get the impression that Well, I guess these ultimately wind up pretty much in the same ballpark. Satan engineering the crucifixion of Jesus to get him out of the way, just like the archons in 1 Corinthians. Or Satan not wanting him to be crucified. No, I'm sorry, that doesn't come out the same. I'm just thinking thinking out loud here. It's as if in Matthew and Mark, though this isn't explicit, that he knows that salvation will come from this and doesn't want it to. He doesn't want Jesus to go to the cross, interestingly. So that's where I think the contradiction is between Matthew and Mark on the one hand, Luke and John on the other. Just to get this even more confusing, do I want to get into this? Oh boy. No, that was just, oh boy, I'm tempted by Satan, I guess. I tend to think that, in case anybody's interested in Bible trivia, or I guess you are, you wouldn't be listening to this, with the temptation narratives, I understand the original, the Markan version, not to imply that Jesus is fasting for the 40 days. In fact, just the opposite. The angels ministering to him implies they're feeding him, just like with Elijah when he took it on the lamb. And Matthew, I think, rejected that and based his three temptation business, where Jesus is taken to a high mountain where he sees the kingdoms before him. That comes right out of the book of Deuteronomy, and where Moses, who is barred from entering the promised land, is taken up to Mount Tabor or Mount Nebo, or whichever one it is, to see the kingdoms that his people will conquer without him. And I think Matthew has borrowed this for the gospel, and that the Ur Lucas, the shorter version that the Marcionites used, didn't have it, and that the ecclesiastical redactor borrowed it from Matthew. It was not in Q, which makes some difference if you're interested in the whole Q thing. Because that would be kind of odd to have an extensive narrative like that in Q when it's mainly just sayings. Okay, anyway, thanks, Brent. Sorry for going so far afield. This is from our pal Dr. Barton. It's kind of long, so I think this will be the last one for this evening. Looks pretty good. He says, a couple of random biblical thoughts hit me recently that I thought might be of interest to you. 1. Jonah swallowed by the fish. I maintain that the entirety of the book of Jonah was not meant to depict an actual event, but a vision related to the Eleusinian mysteries, Demeter and Persephone, given some of the clues left in the story as to the nature of the drug used to induce the vision, datura, in my opinion, I have no strong objections to considering this literary rather than a polished account of an actual vision. We don't know what divine tales were told during the Eleusinian mysteries, initiation cult, subterranean temple, but we can assume that they involved a trip to the underworld, because that's part of the myth, right? Persephone is wedded to Hades and spends half the year in the netherworld. We can assume they involved a trip to the underworld followed by a trip to the Elysian fields, or even the council of the gods on Mount Olympus. Likewise, in the Jonah tale, there is the trip to Sheol being swallowed by the fish. And you remember the psalm that Jonah sings has to do with going down to Sheol. Followed by the trip to the heavenly version of Nineveh. My recent thought was the nature of the fish swallowing. We seem to be missing tales of Yahweh being defeated by any of his primal foes, Tiamat, Leviathan, Behemoth, Rahab, etc. But we do have Psalm 18. Now, let me just pause here. G.L. Wiedengren pointed out that since the creation by combat myth, where Yahweh slays Leviathan, etc. It parallels Marduk, where he slays Tiamat and Apsu, and in the process is devoured by the dragons, but then fights his way out and thus rises from the dead as part of the resurrection, part of the conquest. Okay, let me go back to the beginning of the paragraph. We seem to be missing tales of Yahweh being defeated by any of his primal foes, Tiamat, Leviathan, Behemoth, and Rahab, but we do have Psalm 18, which, after depicting Yahweh battling and defeating the narrator's enemies, mysteriously states, Yahweh lives. Psalm 18:46. There are multiple possible explanations for this outburst, but one is that another tale depicted Yahweh being killed by his enemy, then returning to life to defeat him, just as was told when Baal was defeated by Yam and Mot. An interesting feature to this psalm is that it tells the tale of Yahweh's battle, then sort of retells it as the narrator's battle on earth. Thus we have a possible example of a reenactment psalm or ceremony. By the way, Wiedengren did suggest that psalm was a survival of that liturgy of reenactment, part of the annual, or the Feast of Weeks, Tabernacles, the reinvestment of the king with divine power, the mandate of heaven. Okay. I'd like to propose that Jonah is a step to the side of a reenactment ceremony. I'm sorry, I skipped a bit here. Keeping this reenactment ceremony in mind, and knowing that mystery cult initiations seem to have involved reenactment ceremonies, I would like to propose that Jonah is a step to the side of a reenactment ceremony. Jonah encounters a violent sea, that is, the sea god, Yam. Jonah is not Yahweh. Indeed, part of the point of this story seems to be to show how much greater Yahweh is than any mere mortal. He doesn't really battle Yam, but rather is immediately defeated and swallowed by him and descends to Sheol, similar to Baal being swallowed by Mot. Eventually he returns to life with Yahweh's help. Even Baal needed the help of his sister Anat. Thus it appears to me that Jonah is a fictionalization of a tale told in a Judaic mystery cult initiation. It is obviously told in such a way that it still respects its source, so I'm uncertain if it was told in this fashion to try to draw people from the mystery cult into mainstream Judaism by showing how the mystery cult distorted the true tale, or if it was actually pretty closely related to the initiation tale and told in such a fashion as to bring it into mainstream orthodoxy. I tend to think it's a fragment preserved from that liturgy of the king repeating the primordial struggle of Yahweh to become king of the gods. But as that went out of fashion with no monarchy, then it had to be preserved somewhere, and so it gets historicized as the prophet Jonah. Sharp eye, as always. 2. The seals on the scroll in Revelation. We know from Ezekiel 3:3 that divine scrolls were eaten and were sweet like honey. From Revelation 10, 8 through 9, we know that they were sweet to the tongue but bitter to the stomach. Given the emphasis on eating scrolls, even in Revelation, and the scrolls essentially becoming part of one's body, what do you think of the possibility that the breaking of the seals is in some fashion not the breaking of seals on a warrant, but of restraints on some divine being's body? I haven't had the chance to work through the idea thoroughly, but it seems like there could be something to this idea. Are you saying that's what we're to understand as we read it now, or that this is a kind of half-successful repurposing of such an image? Because it seems like, the scroll has the seals in Revelation, and as he breaks each seal, new entities emerge. are the if it's just that the scroll is predicting or revealing the snapping of bonds of the four horsemen of the apocalypse and so on, it doesn't really make that clear. It seems like they're emerging from the scroll, which of course doesn't make a whole lot of sense either, unless it's metaphorical. Yeah, that's something to think about. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it before, and I'd like to know how, if you're dealing with a scroll with 7 seals on that end, closing the book, sealing the book in that sense, that you're able to unroll, that you're able to read more of it once you break another seal and another, because you still couldn't unroll the scroll a page worth until all 7 had been broken. So something odd is going on there, right? Okay, 3, Old Christmas. Have you ever heard of Old Christmas in Appalachia? That's the January 6th Christmas when the Magi arrived. I just got done reading Hellbender by Jason Jack Miller, and he introduced me to some Appalachian folklore that I wasn't aware of it, and I've read Manly Wade Wellman's Silver John stories. By the way, there's no way you could know this, but just in case other listeners are Wellman fans, Wellman hated when that character was called Silver John. He called him John the Minstrel, and just I'm not criticizing anybody, but I figure I like to honor an author's wishes, and so he would prefer, if he were still around, to prefer that you refer to him as John the Minstrel. So what the heck? I'm a pedantic windbag. I accept it. Okay, 1, on Old Christmas Eve, the livestock gather in the barn and bow to Jesus, who is said to manifest in barns that evening. Afterward, the livestock can be heard discussing what was said, but hearing livestock speak can be disturbing. 2, if you sit under a pine tree on Old Christmas Eve, you can sometimes hear angels declaring the Christ. Unfortunately, if you hear them, then you are likely to die within the year. Boy, that is great stuff. Now, those types of incidents are disturbing, but not really scary. Miller, however, dealt with the implications with a rather short tale of a cousin who was seen going to his bed on Old Christmas Eve and was found struck blind and mute the next morning. The family had no idea what had happened to him, but claimed that they had found his bare footprints leading into the barn when they went to do the chores. What was left unsaid was the idea that if Jesus really had manifested in the barn that eve, then anyone seeing him was seeing God, with all the liminal overwhelming of the senses and mind that implies. He also didn't mention his cousin's footprints coming out of the barn. He followed that tale by casually mentioning that even the adults made it a point to be well out of casual earshot of the barn. Combine those ideas with Knecht Rupert and Krampus, Knight Rupert, right, and Krampus, who deal out punishment and a little well-deserved cannibalism to the bad boys and girls on Christmas Eve, and one can start to see a somewhat less joyous holy day, and one has to consider rather solemnly the idea that to know God is to fear God, especially on Christmas Eve. Ooh, boy, that is fascinating stuff. Thanks a lot, Dr. Barton, a fellow weird fiction fancier. Well, I guess that's it for me tonight, but I hope to be back maybe tomorrow or the next day with another exciting episode of the Bible Geek. And by the way, if you want to contribute to the Kickstarter for the Bart Bob debate, you're urged to do so. And I'll see you soon on the Bible Geek.